G'day team, Adam Cogan here from SSW TV, and today I have a special guest, Richard Campbell. How are you, Rich?
I'm good, friend. Great to be here again.
Yes, well, we have him here in Australia, and I thought I would talk about, well, I had a million topics to talk to you about, but I want to talk to you about writing.
Oh, yeah.
And you, I first came across you when you were writing article after article after article in, trade publications.
Back in the day.
Yeah. VB, VB4, VB5, VB6, Access, .NET, etc. And then you concentrated a lot, rather than writing, I think, on podcasts.
True.
And you run a few podcasts.
The magazine business was dying too, but the podcast grabbed me. I mean, it is all the same problem. It's how do we communicate what folks need to know in the next few months over and over and over again.
And I think .NET Rocks with Carl Franklin has been super successful.
20 years.
Yeah, wow. That's longer than most people get married.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that's true. I've been married longer than that, but yeah, I mean, Carl started it back in 2002. I was a guest in 2004, and I became co-host in 2005.
Right.
So we're at a little over 1,800 episodes now, and yeah, we just celebrated the 20th anniversary.
And then you did the sysadmin.
Run As Radio, I started in April of 2007, when Vista had just come out, because it's a great time to be a sysadmin. But also that I felt like those stories weren't being well told. So that's every Wednesday since April 11th, 2007.
Right. And you skipped the, did I miss any podcasts?
No, those are the two big ones.
So then you skipped kind of being a blogger, didn't you?
I did some blogs for a while, but that, you scratch that creative itch in some way, and the itch was being scratched by the podcasts.
Right.
I mean, especially when you think about when I wound down podcasting, which I think was, or wound down blogging, which was about 2008, I was making 4 podcasts a week. Like, there were 3 DNRs on a Run As every week. So that's just a constant machine of collecting stories and telling them well over an hour or so, over and over and over again.
Right. So I'm thinking about, a young software developer who wants to get better, also wants a successful blog or podcast.
Right.
What advice would you give them to get going?
Yeah, don't worry about trying to make that thing successful. Make it for your own purposes, whatever that may be. I think I really appreciate Scott Hanselman's thought around blogs are a place for you to write stuff down so you can find it again.
Yep.
It's funny when you search on a particular topic and your blog post comes up for it. And that's harder with podcasting. Podcasting is very hip right now and a lot easier to do in the sense that compared to the way it was when we first started back in the day. But it's always a question of what you're interested in. My endless fascination with our problem space, with this whole problem of how we build software and how we build technology to help people, and just helping to gather those stories, that's what drives me. Like, I'm interested anyway. That in some ways, making the product and creating the podcast is really forcing me to finish thinking about something enough to tell a story around it, to sit down to figure out a topic, figure out the right person for it, and to pull that story out and get it well told in the time that we have available.
Okay, so you've pretty much talked about everything. How do you find out whether you should do a topic? Like, if somebody approaches you, or do you approach them, or if they approach you, how do you work out, yeah, that's got legs or that doesn't?
Yeah, it's a lot of all the above. So I live in OneNote. That's sort of my place of managing those things. And I'm always thinking in story arcs. So there are key topic areas for any given show that represent sort of the gestalt of the industry. So a lot of that, today I've got it pretty easy. There's a good listenership that are always giving me feedback, that are sending me emails and communicating in one form or another, or tweeting about shows. And you sort of see those things emerge. I also have the luxury of living in Vancouver, which means I'm only about a 2.5 hour drive from Redmond. And so I'm able to visit Microsoft regularly and talk to the product team. So I kind of know where they're going to. And so then the job then is to break down knowing where the products are going and knowing the concerns that the listeners have. How do I pull up the right stories for each of those things, so to break down where we're going? And so some topics are very topic based. Some are very personality based. Like, listen, if Mads Torgensen wants to talk about C#, the man runs the C# team. I'll talk to him at any time.
Right.
And Mads occasionally does reach out to me and say, hey, we're getting close to talking about a new feature set for the next version of C#. Would you mind? And it's like, okay, let's block out a time and so forth. And I get suggestions all the time for shows. It's very normal, and I'm pretty casual or comfortable with this. Like, I don't think that fits with our audience, or I've already done that subject. What do you think of this one? Let's talk about, should we go further with it? Or let's circle back on that in 3 months, sort of timing and cadence on a lot of those things. And so that you have a consistent narrative built up. But it helps to kind of know where we're going anyway. There's a great line by William Gibson, who's the guy who wrote the term cyberspace. He said, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed." I seem to be able to predict the future a lot, mostly because I know what the future is.
And because you know what happened in the past.
Well, and the past helps. Like, part of the side effect of gathering all those stories is that you start to see this aggregate motion.
Yeah.
And so you can sort of pick up where the rhymes are and where the new opportunities are to tell that story better.
Right. Okay. So when you were giving these examples, were you thinking podcast or were you thinking blog?
Same.
Right.
Doesn't really matter. These are all mediums for telling stories, but it's purposeful, right? Like, what's the goal? Making a podcast, just like making a blog, is about capturing a point in time that ultimately leads to that overall arc. So if you want to have some fun, you go through a bunch of .NET Rocks episodes, call all the C# ones, and you'll see there's a consistent narrative that's evolving in that. Right? If you only look at them week to week, you can't see all of that. But I see that. That's what I work from.
Right.
Is how often we need to visit a given subject and how those things moving forward and where are the events for them. I would pay very close attention to the shows that we make just before a major Microsoft event, before a build already made.
Right.
Nothing in there is accidental.
Right. Okay. All right. So how do you and Carl measure success? Like, are you measuring whether you get people to subscribe or ad revenue or views? Like, how do you?
I mean, all of those things are factors, right? Certainly, how people respond to a given show. The number of downloads are relevant because it does affect the price for the ad. The ads are how we are able to pay for the infrastructure to operate the show. So all of those things ultimately are important. We're pretty particular about our advertisers. We have that luxury, and we have a good industry where folks appreciate being able to reach those developers, so that we're able to do all of those things. I like being satisfied with the show that I make. I care a lot about those stories. Sometimes I will admit to telling stories that I think are good for us, whether we want to hear them or not. We do get pushback on shows where people are like, "Why are you talking about this?" And it's like, "Yeah, because I actually think it's important. Like, we will be better."
Right.
There. So there is some opinion in there inevitably, and mostly that comes from I'm listening to the feedback. I'm listening to folks that I occasionally get long emails about people frustrated with their careers.
Right.
And and I always have time for that. I'll always write back.
Right.
And do my best to help folks however I can. If they, I know there's a lot of people that work. They're the only person that do what they do in the space that they're in. And sometimes we're their connection. And so if they're going to take the time to reach out to me, I got time for them every time. But those always influence my thinking on what stories we should be telling next. So
at the end of a show, when you and Carl are just talking, do you say, "Oh, that didn't work, that stunk," or "That was fantastic"?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I know we're doing really well when we're struggling to hit the break times, like mid-body ads, stuff like. If we're having so much fun in the conversation, that's interesting. But I'm also, I'm a pretty experienced storyteller. So, like, do we have a clear arc in a show?
Right.
Can we get beginning, middle, and end, and bring it in for a close well? And that's part of your job as the host, is to help this expert to tell their story the best way they can. And I have on occasion, folks have said to me, like, I know my stuff and I know why I built this thing, but you make it so much easier for me to tell it. And it's mostly because I put my energy into representing the audience. That all that feedback I've gotten from the listeners, I try and think like they think, not necessarily like how I think, right? Because I approach software very differently. I've been doing this a really long time. So when I think about someone just a few years in on .NET and trying to figure out why we're talking about this, that's the question I'm going to ask. It's not because I don't necessarily know the answer to it, because I think it's the question that somebody would actually ask, and sometimes force that guest to slow down and explain more, because they're skipping ahead, because they've worked on it for so long they forget what regular people know or don't know. So it's, for me, being influenced by the feedback is always so I can represent them well in the conversation.
Right. Okay. So when I started my blog a long time ago, but I also had a problem that it's so date orientated, and I saw it as just events, moments in
Sure.
time, something that happened that I would write about. But I really, really wanted something without dates. So that's how I created the rules, which I kind of think is a blog without dates categorized in order. And then, I'm watching you do the podcast a long time ago and think that's going to be superseded with video. So I just thought you should be, I remember saying it to Carl,
Sure.
you should be doing this via video, forget the podcast. But I was completely wrong when you see what happened with Joe Rogan and stuff.
DNR TV.
Yeah, you did.
But the thing we also learned as soon as you started experimenting with DNR TV is the amount of content went down. For a given time block, you can only cover so much when you do video. Production costs went up dramatically. It's very hard to make good video. And it requires a different level of attention. So the renaissance in podcasting was this acknowledgement of partial attention. That you can listen in your private spaces, that you listen while you drive, right? Because I can't have your eyes while you drive. You'll die. And that's not good for anybody. I lose a listener and you lose, nobody wants to lose a listener. So there is a reason for the medium, right? While you're walking the dog, I've known folks who do it while they're washing the dishes, but it's like, I want to connect with the audience. But there's an interesting side effect to that I think is distinctive to podcasting, which is that because you time shift, you listen to when you want to listen, and you carry me into your private spaces, there's a one-sided relationship being built. I've been in a lot of places inside of your home, and that creates a sense of familiarity. And it gets weird then when we meet.
Yes.
Right? But I always try and be kind. It's like, I know you've been listening to me for a long time. I haven't been listening to you. I haven't heard you. So you do your best, but it's also be respectful of that. Right? It's like, I get it. I help you with the connection there. And that's all really compelling. And that's unique to podcasting, I think. There's always a formality to sitting down and watching a video, right? It's a much more whole body experience where this is just carrying it with you. But we also structure the content for that. I know if you're driving, you're going to be interrupted. So you'll notice that we recap on a regular basis, right? You got to do that callback or people get lost, right? And you organize the material so that it can be picked up and put down well.
Right. So that actually just reminded me of a funny story my daughter told me, that she was with you in New York at some landmark, and she's just chatting to you, and someone came up and says, I recognize your voice. Are you Richard Campbell? Does that happen a lot?
It does.
Right.
Well, a lot. It happens occasionally,
right?
And for better or worse, the voice is pretty distinctive. So if I speak up, people are going to hear, and you have that effect. And that's fine. It's great to meet folks that like your show and to visit with them, and it just everybody's got a story. I'm always interested in those stories.
Right. So the podcast was popular, on commute time.
Yes.
Did you notice it tanked during COVID when people stopped traveling?
It declined for about 3 months, and then it shot up.
Did it?
Yeah, I think people ran out of Netflix,
Right.
and they just needed content. So yeah, and I saw that. Yeah, we saw that with all the shows. There was a period of decline. I even got emails from folks saying, "Hey, I'm not commuting anymore. I don't know how to listen." And then I'm like, "Hey, try working out." Right? There's just other places where I can only have your ears, but then also just content became more important in that time of strangeness, and so that familiarity became really powerful.
And does it continue to grow?
Yeah. More, our industry keeps growing.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we're doing anything perfect by any respect. There's always more developers and more sysadmins. And so the fact that we're out there helps.
Right. So I want to talk about writing a book. Yes.
I'm having a tough time with that, Adam.
So I remember at the beginning when you started writing this book.
The history of .NET.
Yeah,
I've written technical books back in the day, but a history book is a very different creature.
Right. Okay. So they were technical books. The history of .NET is like history, I guess.
Yes.
And so I've been on this journey with you on the RD alias, where we were listening to all the VPs communicating what was going on from the beginning of .NET till now. Did you, I thought that you would finish this a year or two ago.
I thought so too.
Did you bite off more than you can chew, or are you writing multi-volume book or something?
No, I've definitely focused in on particular subject areas. So part of doing all of the research and getting to a place helped me focus in on what I thought were the most important things. And I think part of that is just why do you write a history book? It's to help understand, how .NET transformed. That it started out as one thing and became something else, and what that transformation looks like, which I think is very powerful. And it also reflects the transformation of Microsoft. But the challenge is trying to get it right. And so I made a rookie mistake, not being a historian, and not. And I tried to write literally from the oldest to the newest, and you actually should write it backwards from the newest to the oldest.
Oh,
because you're I've got interviews with multiple people about a given event. They're all different, right? No two people remember something the same way.
Of course.
So you're trying to build a consolidated version of that. And if you make the wrong selections as you work your way through time, you get further and further off the path. And so I hit a point where I just couldn't reconcile it anymore. Where the newest stuff is most close to reality, and so you have a pretty coherent vision of what that truth is, so you can push backwards. So I've had to disassemble the work I did over the past 2 years and reassemble it in a different order.
Oh.
And it's just taking time.
Wow, that's just painful to listen to.
I mean, I have over 100 hours of long format interviews with a lot of influential people that I've promised to keep private because they're very intimate conversations. But they've helped me to, every time I listen to them, I am excited about the subject again. It keeps me engaged. And so as I immerse myself in that and try and untangle these problems, I feel like I'm telling an important story or being part of getting that narrative together. So we're not done yet, but we're getting closer.
So you're a good writer and a fairly fast writer. You used to write a lot of articles,
Yep.
Every single month, long articles. Mm-hmm. Do you know how much you're writing now? Are you chucking stuff out? What's going on here?
You toss a lot of stuff out. You tell it a lot of different ways, but mostly it's about getting the timeline correct. Right? This is a 20-something year, 23, 24-year timeline, and trying to get all of those timelines to glue together properly. I've written lots of pieces in that along the way, which is almost like a reward for me to just sit down and write a bit of narrative, but trying to actually assemble the timeline correctly has been the challenge. And it's also realizing how much of that timeline is not visible to the public.
Right.
So from those interviews have come this entire internal world that .NET was being built in, that we only saw the reflections of in the public. How Entity Framework became open source is a fascinating story that's largely not publicly visible, and was ultimately became important inside of Microsoft. So affects where Microsoft got to, and so pulling those stories up and recognizing them for the importance they are, and then telling them correctly, putting them together. It's just been challenging, rewarding, but hard.
Would I be correct in assuming that the biggest topic in the book that takes the most airtime is Silverlight?
No.
Really?
It's an interesting part of it, and it's part of the inflection point that sort of gets Microsoft closer to pivoting towards the cloud. There's so many parts, dude. It's not easy to say any one of them is essential to the whole thing. But ultimately, the most profound thing you learn about the history of .NET is the transformation from a product built to sell Windows to a product that supports the cloud.
Right.
And how does that product actually make that transformation that we come along with it?
So since you're talking about .NET, does Azure get included?
Inevitably, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's unavoidable.
Do you include Blazor?
Yeah. No,
Really?
it's a talking point. It's certainly in the latter stages.
Yeah.
So the storm, the story arc of .NET, the sort of rise and descent and reascent, Blazor comes in on the way up,
Right.
which is an easier time to talk about.
Okay. I want to finish by just talking about converting a blog to a book.
Oh yeah.
So Troy Hunt's just done this.
Yes. A tremendous amount of effort.
Yeah, a lot of effort.
Yeah.
And he's been thinking about it for a while. And
Yeah.
in fact, I'm very keen to read it because he's got a lot of very interesting parts in his life that have nothing to do with Have I Been Pwned?
Sure.
Yeah. So can you write a blog and then fairly easily take it into a book?
No. It's going to be hard. I mean, because first and foremost, you've got to look at each of those blog posts as part of the meta conversation of the story that you're trying to tell, right? Just a set of blog posts isn't a book, right? That might be a collected stories at best. But the real question is, when you look at the whole of that work, is there an overarching message or an overarching story that comes from that? And if there, and is it well told? Because once you identify that story, and I think if you go read the pwned book, you're going to see that story's in there. I was able to read early copies of it and realize that the pieces, the edits that he was doing, the adjusting was really to support a broader arc narrative. And that's the reason you put those things together. The reason it becomes a book is that there's a bigger message than any one of those stories. And so until you know what that message is and know how to support it, it doesn't make sense to do it. But you get those things nailed down, you'll know what to do.
So do you think it will be successful?
I think it has been successful. And certainly I'm excited to see it finally out into the world. And people are excited to read it. There's things to know. And absolutely worth your time.
But the people reading a blog that keeps popping out,
Yeah.
and the people reading a book, I think they're different people, aren't they?
I think there's going to be plenty of overlap. Lots of blog readers are going to want to read the book. just because the blog is not the whole story. It's all of the things that had to be adjusted to tell a broader story.
So thanks, Rich, for talking to us about how to write, how to do podcasts, how to turn it into a book. I think that's helpful for lots of people.
My pleasure, friend. Everybody does the things their own way. I've been doing it my way for a long time, so I certainly have some opinions, but I'm not convinced it's any of the right ways. Just that you find the way to create the things you want to create.
Yeah. So hopefully that triggers you to, if you're going to be a content creator, give you some ideas. And this is Adam Cogan signing off for SSW TV.